Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Hoffman, and I'm a research fellow here at the Cato Institute. It is my honor to welcome you all to what is going to be a fantastic event, Trump's Iran Gamble. President Trump has launched a war with Iran, leaving the American public and much of the world with more questions than answers. Great uncertainty remains around the war's strategic objectives, the duration of the campaign, and its long term impacts on the United States, Iran, the Middle East, and the world. To unpack these questions, we have an all star lineup, but let me just first start by saying you can submit questions throughout the event via the webpage, Facebook, YouTube, or on X using the hashtag Cato Events. These questions will be answered following the conversation. But to address these important questions, we have a truly all star lineup that I'm honored to introduce here. First, we have Danny Citronowitz. He is a senior researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies in Israel. He served 25 years in a variety of command position units in the Israeli Defense Intelligence, including as head of the Iran branch in the Research and Analysis Division, and as the division's representative to the United States. Nagar Mortazavi is a prominent award-winning Iranian-American journalist, commentator, and senior fellow at the Center for International Policy in Washington, D.C., where she focuses on Iran and U.S. foreign policy. She also hosts a great podcast called the Iran Podcast. Last but not least is Greg Brew, an analyst with Eurasia Group's Energy, Climate, and Resources team, focusing on the geopolitics of oil and gas. He's a historian by trade. We won't hold that against him. He's also the author of two fantastic books, The Struggle for Iran, Oil Autocracy in the Cold War, 1951 to 1954, and Petroleum and Progress in Iran, Oil Development and the Cold War. So, like I said, a lot more questions and answers these days regarding everything going on in the Middle East. So, Danny, I'd like to start it with you. There's a great deal of ambiguity, let's put it that way, surrounding what the United States and Israel intend to achieve throughout the war. In terms of stated objectives, we've heard everything from destroying Iran's nuclear program, which Trump claimed last summer he had obliterated during Operation Midnight Hammer. We've heard that to destroying their ballistic missiles program, liberating the Iranian people via regime change. So, insofar as we can actually identify coherent U.S. and Israeli objectives, what are they and are they achievable?
Well, first, thank you very much for Cato to invite me to this important meeting, and of course for my other colleagues that I think highly of their capabilities and analysis, especially these days. Really appreciate what they have in mind and what they're contributing, especially through X. But again, thank you for inviting me. I think that definitely it's a hard question to answer, but the origin for that, I think, returning back to the 12-day war. And I think that 12-day war ended. Israel had amazing operational achievements, and also with the help of Midnight Hammer and the U.S. attack, managed not to obliterate, but actually significantly damage the Iranian industrialized and enriched capabilities. But the thing is that the day after the war ended, the Iranians returned and rebuilt the capacity. So I think that Israel understood in the last 8 months that the issue is not the capabilities, but the regime itself. So Israel was prepared for another strike. We know that from our defense minister saying that we were ready for another strike in the summer, but since President Trump changed his mind, or he was ready, so we had to push that towards February. So Israel was ready to attack, and I think it was ready to attack not only the nuclear or the missile production, whatever, but also trying to undermine this regime, knowing eventually that this is the solution to prevent Iran from becoming a strategic threat to state of Israel, or continuing being a strategic threat. This is why when Prime Minister Netanyahu identified the fact that President Trump is eager to get involved in possible striking Iran, I think that for him is more or less what the dream come true. This is what they expected from day one of its politics, that the U.S. will take the lead on attacking in Iran. And I think that eventually for Israel, it doesn't matter what will be in Iran in the end. It can be chaos, it can be civil war, it can be even a Western government, not that I think that will be. But the thing is for him is the fact that, or for Israel itself, that everything is better than this regime. So we are hoping, or we hope that whatever we'll try or we'll do will undermine this regime in a way that will try to, will force to be focused only on his survival and whatever, and forgetting the Israeli problem. So that's what Israel really thought, that you can push this threat back. It's not that Israel really I am thinking of, I'm hoping that people go to the streets and change this regime. I think that eventually it's a nice cause to the declarative one, but practically Israel wants to destroy whatever it can in Iran until Trump will say no, and that also leads to problem with the U.S. because the U.S., unlike Israel, really think about the day after. So hitting, for example, the fuel depots in Tehran or in Karaj, this is something that was not encouraged by the U.S. in a way that they think about the day after. They don't want to see a failed state. Trump think maybe of taking over the oil depots in Iran in some way or form. So eventually we saw that problem. But in Israel, the bottom line of that is we'll continue fighting as long as Trump allows us. When we'll say stop, we'll stop because the Israel ability to hit Iran without the US theoretically is there, practically with the US when you know that. So that's where, from the Israeli standpoint. From the US standpoint, we don't know. It's very hard to know because it's one person more or less. I think my personal analysis is the fact that everything happened in Venezuela showed him that he can change things by using the American might. He really thought that Iran is weak. People, I think, told him that Iran is weak, and he thought that he can threaten them by bringing Lincoln and they will capitulate. If not, he will attack them and they will capitulate. If not, they will change the regime by killing Khamenei and finding someone, Delcy Rodriguez from within, that will take over Iran and change Iran for the good. So the combination of him understanding from Venezuela that he can change things strategically and the oil and everything, and plus the fact that he thought that Iran is very weak, led him to the understanding that together with Israel, they can make a change. And the real question is now, what is the exit strategy? Because I don't think they thought about that through beforehand. I think they rushed on false and flawed assumptions regarding Iran, and now we are stuck in a way that we are in some sort of an attrition war. Yes, we have operational achievements, but this is a big but. Strategically, it's not accumulating into a situation where the regime is going to be toppled. I think this regime has the mountain to climb, a lot of problems, but I think for them, the worst is behind them. They overcome the killing of Khamenei. There are frictions. There are decision-making process. There is a plan to make sure that everybody will pay a price for. Then everybody will pressure U.S., especially the Gulf state, to stop the war. So I think in their mind, yes, the suffering goes without saying. The operational cooperation between CENTCOM and IDF is something that really shows a lot of firepower in terms of the Iranians and our ability not to deprive, but to significantly hit those capabilities. But still, the regime is there, I think, for the foreseeable future. So the bottom line of everything is that Israel will wait for the U.S. Trump will decide yes or no. I think that it's a problem to find off ramps and something that will end this war. I think unilaterally, eventually, Trump will end this war. I'm not sure that, by the way, that the Iranians will go for that. We'll have to wait and see. And then, but I think that strategically, I'm not sure the situation that will be after the war, assuming this regime will stay, is better than the situation that we were before the war.
No, it is very interesting the parallels that many have tried to draw between Venezuela and Iran, both prior and following the operation. But unpacking this a bit and looking at the regime, Nagar, if you could give us a kind of a sit rep of what's happening inside Iran right now. So Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is dead. His son Mojtaba is now the new supreme leader. Iran appears to be digging in for a prolonged war of attrition as the United States and Israel increase their bombardment and continue to float these maximalist aims that nobody really knows, which one is ultimately driving policy. We have not seen mass protests inside Iran following the initiation of the war, and it appears that the regime is holding, particularly given the lack of an organized opposition. How do you view the appointment of Mujtaba as the new supreme leader? Is he ready to negotiate with Washington? And what is the overall status of the regime? And what's their strategy to preserve their own power internally as the war drags on?
Thank you. Thanks, John, and the team at Cato for hosting. It's great to see you again, Greg and Danny. It's great to be here. Um, just to your questions from the inside, let me first start by acknowledging that this is very much a war on Iranian civilians, as it is on the state. The civilian toll on the Iranian side is very high. It's reached nearly 1,300. I believe that was even today, potentially even more. Children are among those killed. And one of the first strikes on the first day of the war, before Iran had even started retaliating, was on an elementary school in a southern city of Minab, which killed nearly 200 people, most of them elementary children. And it was a double tap strike. So one came, and then school administrators called the parents of some of the children to come and collect them who were still alive. And then while parents were on the way, the second strike comes, and everyone was congregated in one prayer room to take safety. And then that strike came. So the way the war has been conducted, first of all, in itself, like that, the format and the conduct is just very much harming civilians and civilian infrastructure. There's nothing surgical about this, just going for officials or the regime. Although the supreme leader also was assassinated on the first day, along with many members of his family. And to your question, John, the appointment of his son, Moshtaba Khamenei, also was an interesting turn of events. So Moshtaba Khamenei lost his father, his mother, his wife, one of his children in that strike, in that first day attack. And he wasn't really a likely candidate if you asked any Iran analyst before the war. In fact, there was some implication from his father that he didn't want this sort of image of a reenactment of monarchy, because potentially the Islamic Republic ended millennia of monarchy in Iran, where power was handed down from father to son. And his late father actually didn't want that. And so he, as much as he was, Moshtaba Khamenei is very close to Iran's more intelligence, security, military apparatus, the IRGC. He was seen as sort of the candidate for that part of the establishment. His name was in the mix, but it wasn't seen as a likely candidate. And then there were other more moderate candidates who were being discussed. For example, former President Hassan Rouhani, who's a moderate, and he has a very different outlook on diplomacy, relations with the West. The grandson of former Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khomeini, Hassan Khomeini, also another moderate / reformist. And so I think the turn of events and this essentially the starting of this war, which Iran sees as an existential war, and the assassination of the supreme leader on the first day really led the system into zeroing down on this what is seen very hardline and option as a show of defiance. And I think really the last vote for the new Ayatollah Khamenei was from President Trump. When he said, I don't want this candidate, I can't work with this candidate, I wasn't surprised that his name exactly came out of the mix. So the United States went into this war. It's still unclear what the reasoning was. I mean, the nuclear program has been mentioned, although that was supposedly obliterated in June. That statement still exists on the White House website, where it says it was obliterated, and if you say otherwise, it's fake news. But somehow that nuclear program became another problem for a couple of days. Then, Iran's threat to the U.S., which hasn't really been explained or articulated how exactly that would transpire, but by anyone in the administration. The imminent threat, essentially a preemptive strike on Iran, because the way we heard it from Secretary Rubio was that the Israelis wanted to attack Iran anyways, and the U.S. couldn't stop that, and they knew that Iran would retaliate, and so therefore the U.S. went in first and did this quote-unquote preemptive strike, which is the exact opposite of what a preemptive strike definition is. And then also freedom for the Iranians. I mean, that's been thrown in the mix by the president himself, various members of the opposition, and you speak to people on the ground, there's nothing freeing about bombs raining on people's cities, infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, and with this death toll. So I think what the war has also done inside the country is it has intensified a rally around the flag much more, that effect much more than the June war. Because in June also we saw this sort of rally around the flag for part of the population, the base of the system, but then also rally around the homeland, a sense of unity against this foreign power, which back then it was Israel. But I think that was seen as a more smaller, limited war. People had some end in sight when it came to that war. This time it's the world superpower coming at them by, first attacking an elementary school, killing 200 people, or attacking civilian infrastructure, this immense military power with immense supremacy over Iran together with the regional power who also has military supremacy. And so from the viewpoint of a civilian on the ground, it's unclear where the next target is, if they are going to be it or not. And this doesn't matter if you're in Tehran or elsewhere. I mean, in Tehran is much worse, a densely populated urban area of 10 million, but across the country, I was just talking to someone who was left Tehran to a smaller city 4 hours away, and he said even that place was struck. A number of people were killed. Their photos are on the street. Went to another city. Another person went to another small city in the northwest, far away from Tehran, maybe 10 hours still. He said there was a strike there. So no place in the country do civilians feel immune. And I think the war is just really losing any form of meaning as far as it goes for the Americans and also for Iranians who are on the ground. And we also see that poll after poll shows that it's very popular here in the U.S. It was a war that was launched without the a vote of the U.S. Congress, without the input of the international community, the Security Council, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just very unclear what the objective is, if there's any plan. And I also think, just to wrap, it's still not too late to yet de-escalate, to stop if there's no reason, if there's no justification, if it has been achieved, take a victory. The supreme leader is gone. The regime is somewhat changed. Iran's ability has been very much depleted. They're also inflicting a lot of pain. And I think they want to continue that because they don't want the war to keep coming back at them. And so I think that's the understanding that is lacking very much in the administration, that for Iran, they're essentially playing the long game. It's not just this one time, and it wasn't just June. For them, the war continues until they achieve a ceasefire or a peace that ensures they don't become the next Lebanon or the next Gaza, where Israel, with the help of the US, feel like they can just come in and mow the lawn.
No, absolutely. It seems that even despite the various objectives and rationales that we've heard, the regime is very much so viewing this as existential and is digging in for the long haul to precisely what you just said, show that you can't come in and do this at will. Greg, I'm going to turn to you now. You, of course, had to assume that I was going to ask you an oil question, given your expertise. If you could talk a little bit about the centrality of international energy markets to this war, particularly the increase in costs surrounding natural gas and petroleum since the war began. Yesterday, you tweeted, and I like this a lot, "I don't believe what oil prices are doing, and neither should you." Could you explain what you mean here? How does oil factor into Iran's retaliation strategy? What does this mean not only for oil consumers around the world, but say the Gulf Arab countries who are in the direct line of fire and they depend overwhelmingly on this revenue? And are we about to see U.S. military escorts for vessels traversing the Strait of Hormuz?
Sure thing. Thanks, John. Easy questions that I'm sure I'll have very satisfying answers for. But thanks again for having me here, and thanks to my esteemed colleagues for their wonderful insights. I'll start with just a small insight into the Iranian side here, because I do think it matters. Iran's strategy, as I interpret it, as Nagar and Danny noted, Iran is approaching this as an existential crisis, as an existential war, and they're adopting strategies that sort of match that threat. Iran sees this as a battle of wills and as a war of attrition. And their means of winning the war is to apply pressure to the international community, to the GCC states in the region, but primarily to the United States and to President Trump in particular, to put pressure on energy markets, to squeeze the supply of energy, to cause energy prices to increase, and to essentially create economic and political costs to the United States that make further prosecution of the war unviable. Essentially to make the war too expensive to continue. So this is really a question of not only disrupting the flows of energy, but keeping prices high. As I understand it, that's how Iran sees its strategy. That's how Iran sees its road to victory. And survival here for the regime is really victory. The two goals are sort of one and the same. As far as how it's played out, within 24 to 36 hours of the war breaking out, the IRGC Navy issued a message to shipping in the Strait of Hormuz declaring the strait closed. This was followed by a number of contradictory statements from various figures and bodies within the regime, indicating an ambiguous stance towards the status of the strait. Iran has fired, obviously, hundreds of missiles and drones at the United States bases in the region, at Israel, but also against the GCC and against GCC-related energy targets, elements of GCC energy infrastructure, refineries, export facilities, as well as tankers. These attacks are on a relatively small scale, I would say. About 9 or 10 tankers have been targeted since the onset of hostilities. Around 5 or 6 energy facilities have been targeted. The damage done has been fairly light, but the effect has been as Iran intended. The traffic through the Strait of Hormuz came to a very, very sudden halt on Saturday of last weekend when the war began. Traffic has not resumed. There are currently hundreds of vessels, oil tankers, container ships, and bulk cargo vessels that are waiting on either end of the Strait of Hormuz. And they aren't transiting it because the risk of being targeted by Iran is simply too high. There are additional costs, spikes to insurance, but this is largely a question of security. Shippers don't see the security in the Strait improving anytime soon, and as a result, they don't think transiting the Strait is worth it. What this means is that we are now experiencing, and this will get to my tweet. Thank you for raising that. We are currently experiencing what is the largest oil supply disruption in history. 20 million barrels a day regularly exit the Strait of Hormuz. Most of those 20 million barrels cannot escape the Strait and are not entering global markets. Now, a small amount of oil is getting through. Incidentally, it does appear as though Iran is continuing to export oil. Iran exports around 1.5 million barrels a day, almost entirely to China. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates also have pipelines that avoid the Strait. Saudi has a line that runs east-west across the Arabian Peninsula. UAE has a pipeline that runs to the port of Fujairah on the east coast of the Emirates. So a certain amount of crude will get through, but most will not. All of the Persian Gulf's LNG exports, accounting for about 20% of the global LNG market, all of that gas is trapped. Additional agricultural inputs, fertilizer, chemical exports, everything that the Gulf produces and sends out into the global marketplace cannot escape the Strait and won't be able to escape the Strait unless the United States and allies succeed in using military force to reopen the Strait, which currently has not yet happened. There are plans in place to do so, but they are taking some time to come together. And I think more likely, when the conflict de-escalates. And when we do see both sides, the United States and Israel, as well as Iran, backing down and choosing to end their kinetic operations. But until that happens, energy prices will remain high. The Iranian strategy of applying pressure to the United States through the market, through the energy price in particular, will continue to play out. And President Trump will continue to feel the pressure in that regard. Now, to my tweet, the price of oil. The price of oil has gone through a bit of a journey in the last 5 days. Over the weekend, it spiked dramatically from around $91 a barrel to almost $120 a barrel, the highest level since 2023. It has now fallen back down to around $90 a barrel and has stayed there despite, as I noted, the market currently being in the middle of the worst supply disruption in history. So you would expect prices to be a little higher. I think part of the reason why they have fallen is the recent U.S. rhetorical strategy. The president issued some comments a few days ago and continues to issue similar comments, indicating that the war is about to come to an end. Not that he is ready to end the war, but that it is likely to be short. And I think, given the unprecedented nature of this crisis, there is a certain amount of what the kids would call hopium in the atmosphere. There's this sentiment that this is bad. This is going to have a real impact on the energy market, but it's going to end because the president's going to end it soon. And as a result, prices are a little bit lower than I would have expected in the light of this size of supply disruption. But again, to get back to the crucial point, so long as Hormuz remains closed, and so long as the bulk of the region's energy does not enter into the global market, the pressure on prices to increase, for the price of oil to increase back above $100 a barrel, that pressure will be inexorable. The real key here will be reopening the Strait. The United States, as well as European states, have assembled some plans to do so. There is a European proposal to establish a convoy system by the end of March, although they have caveated that announcement by saying the convoys will only be implemented once security in the Strait is secured. So you will have to see de-escalation before that time. There's been a tremendous amount of pressure on the U.S. Navy from shipping companies to deploy escorts in the Strait. The U.S. Navy has been pushing back against these requests for two reasons. One, the U.S. vessels are still engaged in offensive operations against Iran, so the Navy can't spare the ships to escort tankers. And in addition, and I think somewhat revealingly, the U.S. Navy says the conditions in the Strait are still not secure enough for the Navy to enter into tanker escort operations. In other words, not only would these tankers be exposed to Iranian attack, the U.S. Navy is also concerned that U.S. Navy warships will be exposed to Iranian attack. that suggests that Iran's capabilities have not been quite as heavily degraded as some of the American statements, and certainly the American ambitions at the onset of the operation would suggest. So, as I mentioned, this is a historic moment. It hasn't quite played out in markets and energy prices to the extent that I think is fully reflective of the reality on the ground. And the longer the crisis goes on, the more pressure will appear and the more prices will tick up.
No, thank you, Greg. I think hopium, I haven't heard it described that way before, but I think that's an excellent way to describe it. But I want to stay focused on this idea of costs. And Danny, one of the most central elements of this war is the ability of the United States, Israel, and the Gulf states to sustain their air defenses against Iran's ballistic missiles and suicide drones. Prior to the war, U.S. stockpiles of missile interceptors were already significantly depleted. The United States expended an estimated 25% of its missile interceptor stockpile during the 12-day war with Iran last summer. And Iran maintains a large stockpile of ballistic missiles and suicide drones, though they have expended a lot since the war began. It's largely unknown to the extent to which the U.S. and Israel have hindered their ability to launch such weapons. But in your analysis, where does things stand in this race between Iran trying to deplete U.S., Israeli, and Gulf missile interceptors, and the United States and Israel trying to knock out Iran's ability to fire such projectiles?
Well, again, a very important question. But before I want to relate to things that actually I'm driving from everything that Negar and Greg saying. Of course, I agree with everything that they're saying. I think the one thing that we have to focus. You asked about the everything related to the targets of the war. What is the purpose? I think the contradiction in terms when we got to the nuclear, because at the end of the day, Iran under Khamenei, the father, not the son, was willing to show significant compromises on enrichment, not on everything else, of course. So if you want to block the Iranian path to reaching a fissile material and dilute the materials that already have, the 140 kilos, that would be very hard to extract that with no agreement, then you should have gone to an agreement. Yes, the downside was strengthening the regime, but you could have prevented them from reaching a nuclear bomb. And I can say that someone that is suffering from the Iran missiles, it's a threat, and it's not an existential threat. The existential threat is the nuclear. On top of that, he actually killed the first day the guy, the person in the Iranian regime, meaning Khamenei, Ali Khamenei, that actually was against rushing into a bomb. He actually was in favor of that limbo, not for going enrichment, not actually crossing the Rubicon and becoming like a military nuclear country. So now you have Mujtaba Khamenei that actually want to avenge the death of the family, controlled by the RGC, with the 440 kilos that hopefully, for the 60%, that somebody will take it out, but whatever. So I think that this war actually pushes Iranian more towards a bomb than actually an agreement. So we have to think in that in mind and where we stand right now. Regarding your important question, I have to say that the Iranians came to this event not surprised. From the end of the previous war, they knew that war would come. They didn't know when, where, who, but they were prepared for it. So they prepared a plan, actually, and we see that happening in a way that they're not going to focus only on Israel. They will focus a little bit on Israel to create more like the psychological aspect of things, less just bombing everywhere, because I think they know that now they have to launch missiles also towards the Gulf states, and also because of the fact they're not coping only with the Israeli Air Force, but also the US one. So what we had from the beginning of the war is small barrages, salvos of missiles towards Israel, but significantly barrages of UAVs and missiles towards the Gulf states, and a little number of UAVs to Israel. So I don't think, again, we don't know how many interceptors we have, of course, in Israel. It's a secret. But I don't think that given the amount of missiles that are being launched towards us from Iran, towards Israel, that we have a problem in that. I hope that we don't have, but I don't think it's different from the previous war that we had. Yes, we have problems now with Hezbollah in Lebanon, whatever, but it's a different type of rockets and missiles, and it's not the Arrow, it's the Iron Dome and other elements of our active defense. But so I think that this is not the problem. Same thing goes to the UAVs that it is easy to intercept for Israel. So I think The Israel is more about the everything of psychological aspect. Last night we rushed to our bomb shelter at the home for 3 times at night, including 4 o'clock at night, 1 o'clock at night. So it's very hard to have an ordinary life. So, like Greg said, they want to make sure that everybody will pay the price. We are paying the price. Yes, we had some unfortunate people killed, but I think the number is, of course, everyone has its own, his family and everything. But I don't think the number is it's a big number. The thing is, actually, they're managing to disrupt our life. We don't have work. We don't go to work. We don't have, the kids are staying at home, learning through Zoom. So this is the problem. The problem is not interceptions and whatever. It's just them just trying to harass us. And I think that they are calculating their efforts. They know it's going to be a long, lengthy war of attrition. So launching, but in a way that it's actually it's creating problems to Israel, not as such that we are not able to overcome it. This is for the Israeli one. For the Gulf states, I think it's a major problem because you have the missiles, but definitely you have the drones, and it's very hard to cope with the drones. Yes, they have active defense. Most of those countries, high-end active defense for most of them, but at the end of the day, they are not used to this attack. Their population are not used to this attack. They have, in the Iranian view as well, they don't have resilience like Israel has because of what we endured during our history. So the problem is that even if they would have limited number of UAVs, and it's very hard to kill the chain of UAVs because it's very easy for the Iranians to build, manufacture, then we have to assume that Iran has the capability, despite everything that's happening now, also to continue that at least for weeks. If there is an assessment in Israel that they have 1,500 ballistic missiles left and more than 100 launchers, then I think that we'll have to face that in Israel, but also in the Gulf states for at least 2 or 3 weeks more, if not even more than that. Again, not knowing exactly what the US and Israel did, but I think this is something that we can assume maybe. So the bottom line of things that the problem is that we won't be in zero, meaning that yes, the US and Israel hammering everything related from the launching bases and the production lines. But I think at the end, because Iran was getting ready for this war, they still have the capacity to launch those missiles. And on top of that, they have some success in attacking the radars and the US active defense. So we can feel that also in Israel. You can feel that the alarms or the ability to give you a warning a little bit shortened because of that aspect. So when you're looking all of that, I think that we have to assume that in the weeks to come, again, I don't know if it's months, but in the weeks to come, Iran will still have the capacity to launch missiles against the state of Israel. We still have the capacity to launch missiles, and especially drones, toward the Gulf states, and let alone, of course, attacking convoys or tankers in the Gulf. So I think that I'm not saying that they don't have problems. Definitely, the Israeli and US attacks make a difference in a way. It's making them very hard to launch those capabilities. But again, the Iranians have that experience. So I think if someone thinks that it can go down to zero, close to that, I think that they are mistaken.
No, thank you, Danny. Thank you for adding in the part too about the nuclear aspect of all of this. Nagar, I want to switch back to you. There's been a lot of discussion and rumors about how perhaps in the absence of the United States or Israel being able to install a friendly government in Tehran, another possible objective of theirs, and you kind of hinted at this earlier, is essentially collapsing the Iranian state. Some advocates of this approach have described it as, quote, removing Iran from the geopolitical chessboard. Trump seems to have walked back some of the rumors about the U.S. Arming the Kurds in Iraq to intervene in Iran. But what do you make of this idea that the U.S. or Israel could essentially collapse the country and walk away? How feasible is this? How is this narrative being received inside Iran? And what would this mean for the broader region?
Absolutely. That's a great question. Yes. I think maybe from the Israeli viewpoint, and maybe Danny can speak to the details of this more, but that seems to be an objective or a goal or a result that the Israelis wouldn't mind, delivering a weak state, potentially a failed state, maybe even multiple states, as you're saying, John, removing Iran from the geopolitical chessboard, or essentially this, regional power, this medium power that poses no threat to Israel, because Iran didn't pose a threat to the US before it was attacked by the US. It still doesn't really pose a threat to US assets and bases in the region. The carriers are parked so far away from Iran. Iran can barely reach them. The bases that they're trying to hit in the Gulf. I mean, the amount of damage and casualty that Iran has been able to inflict on the US is limited, minus the oil issue, which Greg explained so well. And which is actually one of the goals for Iranians, to drive up oil prices and really hit Trump with that in a domestic sense, and essentially convince him to stop. But as far as Iran becoming a failed state, first of all, I think that's a terrible idea. I mean, I hope that's not something that's pursued seriously in Washington. The Kurdish issue was discussed here, remember, in DC for maybe 2 or 3 days before everyone basically came out and said it's a terrible idea. And then eventually, even the president, I think, said that that's off the table. I hope it's off the table permanently. And then also, in the complexity of this, or the irony, is that even the Kurds on the other side didn't seem very interested in Kurdistan in Iraq. This is an issue for the Iraqis also, not just for Iran. It's a very serious issue for the Turks. I mean, Turkey has a vested interest in not dealing with this Kurdish problem. If it really looks like it's seriously turning into an actual problem, it's not just going to be directed at Iran, but also Turkey. So I think the pressure against that and the pushback was very strong. Although in that time, we know that the Israelis and the US, I mean, it's hard to distinguish who is exactly doing what, but they did bomb a bunch of border area stations and border patrol and police, whatever, different stations across the Kurdistan border to sort of weaken that crossing and essentially open the door for this Kurdish separatists. I mean, Iran is ethnically diverse. There are various different movements within the ethnic groups. It's not just the Kurds, it's also the Baluchis, a large Arab population in the south of Iran, the Azeris in the northwest, and a few others. And some of these movements do have an armed insurgency within them, a separatist tendency, which doesn't necessarily apply to everyone in those areas. Like, not all Iranian Kurds are separatists or armed insurgents. That's also very important to distinguish, because it is a large Kurdish population, it is a large Arab population, it is a large considerable Baluchi population, but these border areas have always been seen as a threat from the viewpoint of the central government, and it's also something that the Islamic Republic is very sensitive about. So as soon as this Kurdish issue was discussed or was seen as something serious that the CIA was pushing, the Israelis were pushing, I think that response in Tehran was very quick, and the reaction was very fast, and they were gearing up to make sure they essentially nip it in the bud, and nothing like that even takes shape or form, because they understand that it can also really become a serious problem. So the danger of that exists, although I do hear people arguing that Iran is not like Syria, Iran is not like Libya, and it's correct. I mean, these arguments are correct, but not entirely. I mean, there is also potential and the capacity for the country to turn into a fragmented, a civil war essentially situation to erupt. It may be further down the line. We're far away from that situation yet. I think the understanding, or the lack of understanding in Washington, is how coherent is the Islamic Republic, how strong it is. It's not very popular. It's repressive, it's authoritarian, but so is everyone else in that neighborhood. And it also has a lot more. I mean, this is a nation state. It's one of the largest in the region, one of the most populated in the region. I've seen comparisons to Venezuela, completely wrong. I've seen comparisons to even Hezbollah when they talk about decapitation. This is a large nation state with a state that has actual institutions, very powerful institutions. And we see their top leader, supreme leader, was taken out immediately. They regrouped. They had a leadership council in place that was running the day-to-day. The top brass was eliminated, immediately replaced by lower ranks. And the Iranians have been saying this, that they do have lower and lower and lower ranks ready to take over, because they predicted this day to come. And yes, they're the underdog, but they're also shooting back. They're fighting back. They're retaliating. And they're seeing this as sort of the long game, again, as I said, to make sure that this war doesn't keep coming back to them, that the Israelis don't uh, believe, or also make believe, convince Washington again and again, and that Iran is weak and is about to fall and just needs one last push, which happened in June. We know it happened again today. And then finally, one added element to that is this idea that regime change can come from the inside, that I think was really pushed in June by the Israelis. And we saw none of that. We saw no major defections from within the system into the population. And we also saw no real uprising. Yes, Iranians, there's a lot of discontent. There's a lot of opposition to the status quo, political, economic, social reasons. But one issue is that not everyone who protests on the street necessarily wants this kind of regime change with bombs coming from the sky, a foreign military intervention. A lot of Iranians are actually very skeptical about the day after a war and the scenario of going down the path of Syria and Libya. And then the other issue is during wartime, we didn't see that. We saw protests in between. We saw protests before the war, after the war, but not during wartime. So this idea that I think, again, the Israelis are pushing, and then the president tweeted about it, encouraging Iranians to come out and take their institutions during wartime, which, by the way, that directive also changed because later it came from Washington that actually, you should stay inside at home because it's not very safe outside, as it isn't. So I think that scenario also hasn't really taken any shape or form. Again, we're not seeing any major defections. Again, we're not seeing cracks in the system. In fact, if anything, it's getting more hardened, more, powerful within. And also a rally around the flag within their base, which seems to be growing and just getting stronger inside the country.
No, thank you for that, Nagar. Greg, I asked you previously about the economic costs of this operation as they pertain to oil and gas, but what about the political costs for Donald Trump? Polls from a variety of reputable organizations show that this war is quite unpopular with the American people. Trump ran on the platform of no more endless wars in the Middle East and lower prices domestically. But it seems as though he's delivered the opposite, and this is starting to be reflected in polls. How do these political costs influence Trump's calculus moving forward in his ability to pursue this war open-endedly inside Iran?
Well, I think that's the right way to think about it as far as, are the political costs, when will the political costs be sufficient to bring about U.S. de-escalation? I think that's part of what the Iranians are gambling on, that eventually Trump won't be able to continue a war that keeps oil prices high, that keeps energy prices high, and that threatens to keep the U.S. continuously engaged without delivering a decisive victory. And I think that's kind of the key way of thinking about it. When Trump launched this war, I think it was with the idea of delivering some kind of decisive win. It wasn't going to be just, mowing the grass, as the Israelis call it, hitting Iran again after the war last year to further degrade its capabilities. I think the president was convinced that there was scope for something more grand, more decisive, more eye-catching, along the lines of what was achieved in Venezuela. I think it's now apparent that such a victory is unlikely. And so it's a question of how long will Trump hold out as far as continuing this conflict, continuing this level of U.S. engagement. You're right that there is resistance both across the broader American population, but also within Trump's base, which incidentally I think is the constituency that we really should be thinking about most. I don't know if Trump really cares what the majority of Americans think, but he does care what his constituents think, his base. And there has long been resistance to any kind of U.S. military operation that looks like an open-ended intervention, that looks like it could turn into a quagmire. There's lots of support for muscular demonstrations of U.S. military power, for projects, operations that demonstrate U.S. military primacy. That's something this administration has pursued quite aggressively with the support of its base. I mean, when this war began, military operations against Iran were polled quite well in the MAGA base and across Republicans generally. I think you're starting to see those polls turn a little bit as we enter the second week of a war that still doesn't really seem to have a decisive endpoint. But when we can think about how the pressure works, this is a president, an individual who across his entire career, his whole adult life, has demonstrated a predisposition to care about gasoline prices. He's constantly talking about the price at the pump. He's constantly talking about, how expensive gasoline can be, how that's an indication of economic mismanagement. He's been resisting that narrative now, I think unsurprisingly, given that this war is the reason why gasoline prices have increased or are going to continue to increase. and has defended it as a short-term blip, as something that victory over Iran will make insignificant, that prices will come back down. His administration's been talking about increasing domestic production, leveraging more oil from Venezuela, neither of which are really going to matter too much in the short term because it takes a long time for those factors to weigh in across the broader energy market. The fastest way to bring energy prices down and reduce the pressure is to end the war. But I don't think the president is quite there yet. I think it's likely going to take a little bit more time and higher prices for this to really turn into a point of pressure. As far as the material impact, I mean, when we think about the price of gasoline, for instance, as an element of the domestic economy, obviously it hurts consumers and it's a part of overall consumer spending. But there are other, I think, more important macro impacts from a crisis like this that may end up turning, weighing the scales in a more significant way. If the supply of fertilizer and agricultural inputs from the Gulf is continuously constrained, that's going to have an impact on food economies across the world. It might actually end up increasing the price of food here in the United States. One of the first energy products that reflected this crisis as far as increasing prices was the price of jet fuel. Airfare is almost certainly going to become more expensive in the United States and in other economies March through the rest of the spring. Airfare, incidentally, is an element in inflation prints. The next CPI print could show an uptick in the rate of U.S. inflation. That's going to look bad since everyone will immediately connect that inflation increase to this war against Iran. So I would look at it more in terms of, will this push Trump towards a more rapid, earlier de-escalation? It's a little bit hard to say. I do think the longer the crisis goes on, the more the pressure increases, the more attractive a de-escalatory off-ramp is going to look. But right now, Trump is resisting that pressure. He still seems convinced, at least outwardly, that there is scope for a more decisive victory, even as the ingredients for such a victory do appear to have vanished from the strategic chessboard.
No, thank you, Greg. I think a question that I'd like to pose to all three of you is this is a question that I personally always dread being asked. So, of course, I'm going to put it to the three of you. How long does this last? The Trump administration has issued just such a series of contradictory statements regarding timelines. Just this week, as we've noted, Trump himself has hinted at the war possibly ending very soon. And continuing indefinitely until the job is done. So which is it? Where do we go from here? And whoever would like to take the first bite at this question, by all means. Don't all jump at once.
I will try. No problem. It's from the Israeli standpoint, it's quite easy. When Trump will decide, we will stop. So it's easier to explain when, from Israel's standpoint, it's gonna stop. Yes, I'll say one thing before we'll touch about the time frame, that if this war will end without taking care of the 440 kilos for 60% and rich uranium in Isfahan, then we cannot call it's not going to be a victory. I think it would be a victory with taking that out, but definitely it's a problem that a guy like Mujtaba and the support of the agency will have this capabilities. It's problematic situation, to say the least. So regardless when it's going to end, this is one element. Second, I don't think it will end because of shortage of missiles from one end to the other, meaning that the Iranians will capitulate, or Israel had problems with own defense. I think what will set the tone at the end of the day is like what Greg said from the get-go, is the issue of energy. And I don't think, given the fact that it would be very hard to open Hormuz Straits while Iran is literally on the Hormuz Straits. And I'm not even speaking about the possibility of the Houthis getting involved in blocking Bab el-Mandeb Strait. So I think that this is what will set the tone in terms that the oil price stay high, despite all the Trump stating it will end very soon because that it will have a positive effect on the price of barrel of oil. I think at the end the market will see if the war continues or not. So while assuming that this war is costly in terms of the energy sector, and now what happened, for example, the Iranians attacked Salalah oil depots in Oman, near Oman. So I think that's obviously the price will get high. So my assumption that it's not going to take 4 to still 6 weeks, because there's the regime is now on a collapsing mode, meaning that it's not like you'll say to Trump, "Oh, just let's continue 4 6 weeks until 4 6 weeks, and then it will collapse." It's not going to happen. Nobody can assure that. So not having this kind of assurance coming from in terms of what the future of the regime will be, and adding to the oil price and the gas price and everything to the fact that the Iranians will find it very easy to push that upwards because of the control of the Hormuz Strait and ability to hit tankers and oil depots all over the Gulf using their drones and missiles. So my sense is that we're in the final stretch. It can take, it's not that it will end tomorrow, and it can take a week or two, but I think I will surprise if it will take more than that, unless something dramatic will happen, and things can happen. It's in the Middle East. So my crystal ball and my guesstimation saying that I think that by the time that Trump needs to go to meet Xi in Beijing, this war will end.
Thank you, Danny. Greg or Nagar?
I can add a little bit. I think from the Iranian viewpoint, again, talking about playing the long game, I don't think the calculation in Tehran is that they've inflicted enough pain, enough, deterrence. Again, for them, this is a trajectory. They see a trajectory. They took a very big blow at the beginning, and then they played sort of this waiting patience game to try to overwhelm the other side, and then escalate, and then the oil prices, driving up the oil prices and all of that. It's something that's still brewing from the Iranian side. They're also taking major hits, and the civilian toll is just really horrific also. But I think they had prepared themselves for this high cost to be able to inflict the pain, because again, from the Iranian viewpoint, the time between these wars, I mean, from June until the start of this war, was also a period that they were paying a cost. So that war didn't stop completely for the Iranian side. And so in their thinking, continuing it a little bit longer would help with that growing trajectory of pain on the other side on the Gulf, because they also want sort of a shifting of dynamic in the Gulf. They want a change, a permanent change, a long-term change in how U.S. bases are stationed in that region that were supposedly there to protect, for defense of these Gulf countries, and now they're turned into, or the Iranians see them as part of this entire infrastructure of a country that is now attacking them. Enough pain on Israel so that Benjamin Netanyahu can't keep coming to the White House and telling the US president that Iran is weak and we can go back every 6 months, every year. And then, of course, on Donald Trump. I mean, for the US, the US is the one party that this war seems so, senseless to, if you're sitting from the vantage point of an average American in the US. I was actually on NPR the other day for an hour, and they took calls, and every single person that was calling from across the US, the core of the question was why. We don't understand why, like how it is. Because if you ask someone in Israel, like I'm sure Danny and people around you, people can, justify various different reasons, or across the region. But from the viewpoint of an average American sitting across the US, the question is just why. It seems like the US is just paying a cost. I was looking at the cost of war. Initially, it was calculated about $1 billion per day, but now it seems like it's even higher if you consider the cost of just ammunition. So, billions of dollars so far for a war that, and also American blood, not just treasure, but also American blood, that just doesn't seem like it's justified. And you see these members of Congress coming out of briefing, classified, non-classified briefing after briefing, and just saying, I'm more confused than I was before going into this briefing, and I don't understand why. So I think, going back to the core question, from the Iranian side, it's still not enough. They're still not at that point. They're potentially also thinking about folding Hezbollah, for example, into the ceasefire process. That's one of the reasons that we're seeing the involvement of the axis of resistance, or whatever's remained on it. Potentially, maybe even the Houthis down the line will try to enter and engage. We've seen some movements in the militias in Iraq. So that entirety of the axis hasn't really engaged in this yet. And I think Iranians don't feel like they've inflicted enough of that pain to establish enough deterrence to stop this from happening, at least in the next 3 years of the Trump administration, but also potentially for future US administrations to come.
Greg?
I won't say too much because Danny and Nagar have made such excellent points, but I would draw a little question mark next to end, because I don't know if we're going to get a decisive end to this conflict. I think we're more likely to see kind of a phased tapering off, unless two things happen. Unless the United States, through President Trump, decides to engage de-escalation more assertively, more decisively, to signal that the operation is over so that the Strait of Hormuz can open quickly. That is a possible off-ramp that would see a rapid end to the conflict. I'm very conscious, though, of Nick Otter's points that Iran will want to make sure that the conflict ends with their deterrence restored in at least some capacity. So that may discourage Iran from, following the U.S. lead and de-escalating. Israel, of course, I defer to Danny, although I think I agree with his point that, if the U.S. stops, Israel is likely to stop as well, because Israel can accomplish a great deal more against Iran with active U.S. support than going it solo. Also, incidentally, I think Bibi Netanyahu needs to demonstrate his close connection to Trump and his ability to gain close U.S. cooperation in defense of Israel in pursuit of Israel's strategic aims. That's really going to come in handy with elections coming up in a couple of months. So I think Israel-U.S. cooperation will probably follow one or the other, but Iran might seek a slightly longer confrontation. But if there's rapid U.S. de-escalation to reopen Hormuz, we could see an end to the conflict. Another way would be through third-party mediation. If there is a ceasefire that is organized through some kind of mediator effort, that could also see a more rapid de-escalation. But again, the problem there is that there's no good mediator to turn to. Iran could potentially get mediation from Russia or China. I would be hesitant to say, however, that Donald Trump would look favorably on a mediated peace with Iran negotiated by Russia or China, considering that those are states towards the United States regards as adversaries. There are other mediators potentially in the Gulf, but I don't know if Iran would see them as capable of mediating an agreement, seeing as how most states in the Gulf have been under Iranian attack for the last 2 weeks. So my view is that I think the U.S. will eventually start backing off as Trump starts to see less political upside, potentially political and economic downside to continuing this conflict. But it might take a while, given that both the U.S. and Iran will continue to be in heightened states of military readiness, given that Iran, to Negar's point, is going to continue to want to impose costs to bolster its deterrence and reduce the likelihood of future attacks, given that one of the main reasons Hormuz is closed is uncertainty and ambiguity regarding Iran's stance. Iran hasn't closed the strait. It has threatened to attack anyone who tries to get through the strait, and that's why the strait remains closed. So I think, rather than thinking about when this conflict ends in a decisive moment, I think it might be more useful to think about what the next 2, maybe even 3 months look like in the event that the U.S. does start to ease off the offensive operations. We could see a longer period of tit-for-tat strikes, a longer period of higher tensions, and even if Hormuz reopens, pressure on energy prices is likely to remain quite high.
Thank you, all three of you. I'd like to now turn to audience questions. Please remember that you can submit your questions either online on Cato's website, or you can do so on social media using the hashtag Cato Events. The first question comes from Greg Meyer of NPR. He says, we don't seem to be hearing a lot about Iran's nuclear facilities. Do you know why? Is this because the facilities are not being targeted at this point? Is that because there's not much left to hit, or is the U.S. hoping to seize the highly enriched uranium? And I think this dovetails pretty nicely with not only what we've been talking about, but recent reporting of the United States possibly using special operations forces to go in on the ground and seize this uranium. So I'll let anybody who wants to take a first stab at this get at it.
I'll just very quickly, as far as going on the ground, I encourage everyone to go look at a map of Iran. Just see one of the largest countries in the region, the vast land, and also where the nuclear sites are deep inside the country. Just geographically, I'm trying to imagine how that kind of an operation of the U.S. going in and extracting that material, assuming that they know exactly where it is just going to be so complicated, and also the chances for error and all of that. I also want to make a reference to the operation under President Carter in the early 1980s that was attempted to try to go and rescue U.S. diplomats who were being held in the embassy in Tehran. But anyways, as far as attacks, again, it's not very clear if this is still even an issue or not. As I said, the nuclear program was supposedly obliterated in Operation Midnight Hammer back in June, and very specific kind of operation with the B-2 bombers. And supposedly, I don't even know if there's more that can be done as far as rebombing those sites and whatever is remaining of them. But I'm curious to hear what Greg and Danny think, if this is also a calculation in Israel, if the Israelis would have any kind of involvement is something like that. Or I don't know if the nuclear issue or the nuclear threat is even being seriously considered, because we also heard from the IAEA chief, the UN nuclear watchdog, confirming that Iran wasn't close to weaponizing the program or building a bomb. So how much of this really is a threat and how much of it is political rhetoric, I think is important in determining whether this will really turn into an actual operation.
Thank you, Nagar, and thank you for bringing up the geography part too. I mean, Iran is the 17th largest country in the world by area and population size. Greg, Danny? So let me go to another question here. This question is posed anonymously, and it's more so on the Israeli angle of things. And it mentions that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was pretty central to not only trying to scuttle the deal between Washington and Tehran, but also the overall push for military action. Even if Trump gets cold feet regarding the economic and political costs of the war, will Netanyahu? And if this divergence occurs, what could we possibly see? Danny, if you want to take first bite at this one, by all means. Oh, I think Danny disconnected accidentally. Again, Danny has been going back and forth between his home and the bomb shelter. So, Greg, Nagar, if either of you would like to take this one on first.
I mean, I'll take a stab at it. I think I think, at the outset of the war, I think there was pretty strong indications that the U.S. and Israel were kind of operating from the same playbook as far as the goals of the war. I think, given that Israel has, I think, maybe more to achieve in the context of this war strategically. Danny has made those points repeatedly. That is, Iran is a more potent threat to Israel than it is to the United States, and this is a greater opportunity for Israel and for Netanyahu to strike another blow against the regime and potentially even, push it towards collapse. That is a stated Israeli objective, even if it's only an aspirational U.S. one. I think there is likely to be some friction between the U.S. and Israel, but I think when it comes to ending the conflict, as I made the point a moment ago, I think it makes more sense for Israel to follow the U.S. lead, provided that there is still space for resuming the conflict at some point in the future, right? So long as the Islamic Republic exists, it continues to pose a threat to Israeli security. That's how Israel perceives it. When it comes to Netanyahu's particular calculations, I think he's been quite effective at managing his relationship with Donald Trump. Which is, incidentally, history suggests that is a relationship that world leaders often struggle with. Trump doesn't have stable relationships with a lot of world leaders, but his relationship with Netanyahu has actually been pretty consistent, at least during this administration. So that suggests to me that, if the U.S., and again, I largely see the process of de-escalation in this conflict running through the Oval Office. I think we'll start to see a wind down in the conflict when Trump decides he's had enough and it's time to wrap things up. I do think it's more likely that Israel follows the U.S. lead, again, so long as there is an understanding that if Iran rebuilds its ballistic missile capabilities or attempts to reconstitute its nuclear program, Israel remains, at will, at freedom to launch strikes at Iran if it perceives the threat. The bigger question for me is on this question of regime change or regime collapse. I mean, even if Trump decides that, getting another Venezuela is not possible or not worth it, even if his interests turn to other foreign policy files, is Israel going to take its foot off the gas? Is Israel going to continue to try to push this regime towards collapse, given that it has capabilities for doing so, and given that Iran is likely to remain weak? That's another question I have as to how this conflict evolves when we do get de-escalation, at least in the kinetic phase. Looking ahead, how the confrontation, at least between Iran and Israel, might evolve. That's something I'm going to be thinking more about.
No, absolutely. Nagar, did you want to take a stab at that one, or I can go on to the next
I
question?
Yeah, no, I agree with Greg, and I don't think that this Israel can do this alone. I mean, that's also one of the calculations of Iran. And while Donald Trump is in office, essentially that's the trajectory of this immediate threat that they see for the next 3 years. That if the thinking is that the Iranians' projected weakness, they can keep going back the Israelis with the support of the U.S., and that's why they want to stop this. And essentially reestablish some deterrence and then decide for after the Trump administration.
Perfect. Shifting from Israel to Iran, we have a question here from Jesse. It seems like the Trump administration has a theory of victory based specifically on the Iranian government capitulating. Capitulation doesn't seem likely. Do you think the administration has the interest and or willingness to revisit this assumption, essentially to walk back this maximalist demand of unconditional surrender and of capitulation, or to what extent has Trump cornered himself into now a quagmire that he has set the bar at just such a high level?
That is such a great question. It also has some of the answer embedded in it. Very smart question. I think if I want to explain it in very simple terms, Trump and Tehran really was just this combination, the utmost clash of personalities. I mean, on the Tehran side, it wasn't just one person, the entire system. But with President Trump from the first term, I mean, the way he is approaching this, I would say that he came to this issue not as ideological as many other Republicans. He's actually, I think, towards Iran and sort of that entirety of the neocon hawkish sort of wing of the party. He came to this issue a lot more agnostic. And the problem for him wasn't that a previous president made a deal with the Iranians or negotiated with them, shook hands, or met with the enemy. It was that it wasn't his deal. It was a deal of a president he didn't like, President Obama. And so he wanted to make a deal. He wanted to do exactly that, even better. So I think that opened, and I've told the Iranians this many, many times, that opened a very golden opportunity, a very rare opportunity for Iranians, this powerful Republican president from a party that is traditionally against engagement and diplomacy and talks with Iran and would try to, impede it as much as they can, that he wanted that. But the way he approached it and the format that he wants, that's not so much about the content, but actually the format, the very public negotiations, the photo ops, the meetings, the shaking hands before you even make a deal. North Korea style, the way he went and met with Kim Jong-un, nothing really came out of it, but I would say at least they didn't escalate and end up into a war. And the Iranians just didn't want to play that game. I mean, they don't want to play that game of capitulation or surrender, which comes down the line. But even from the beginning, their argument, which I think is a fair argument, but it just didn't fly with Trump, was that, look, we negotiated a deal in a very long process. We negotiated a deal with the United States of America. We don't care who was president. This was the United States of America and also other world powers. And we're abiding by that deal. It's only been, a couple of years, and now a new president comes. Why should we renegotiate a whole new deal? This just doesn't make any sense in international, affairs terms. But this was an unconventional president. He unraveled a lot of things that were done before. And I think that opportunity, that sort of window of opportunity closed when he pulled out of the JCPOA and lost hope in the first term, and then the assassination of Soleimani. It's just been downhill since then. I mean, all of this, where we are, is a trajectory that started in 2018 with 17 and then 18 with the pulling out of the JCPOA, 2020, the assassination of Soleimani. And it just put Iran on a more defiant position towards this president. That I think even limited the ability of the Biden administration in the Biden era, although they also didn't want. They kind of continued that maximum pressure policy without calling it by what it is. But I think it just put Tehran and Washington on a trajectory of just failure of diplomacy and more towards conflict and escalation. And then again, in this second term, I think the president still, I do believe that he wants a deal. He wants that bigger, better, longer, stronger deal with Iran. It's not very clear what it looks like that he even knows what a better deal looks like, because it sounds like what the Iranians offered to Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner was actually a very good deal. It was just short of capitulation. But I think this idea that they would come and tell you, we surrender, we capitulate, like a Venezuela situation, like many other world leaders that really treat him the way he wants, the Iranians would not do that. I mean, the core of the main slogan of the Islamic Republic in 1979 after the revolution was independence, was istiqlal, sovereignty, forging sort of their own strategic thinking and place in the world. All of that really, really matters to the Iranians, to the point that they're willing to give their life for it. I mean, the supreme leader was killed because he wouldn't want to capitulate and surrender. Top brass, senior leaders, and the rest of them are just going to continue. So will his son. And this is just not something that's going to come out of the Iranians at a very high
Thank you,
cost.
Nagar. Thank you. And Danny, welcome back. Just to update you, we're talking about the odds of Iran capitulating, this complete and total surrender that Trump has kind of set such a high bar at. So, Greg, Danny, either of you, please.
Yeah, I'll say something about it, and I think just continue what Nagar said. I think that the main problem that this administration has is the fact that they don't understand Iran. They have, I don't know who told them what, but eventually in negotiation and in war, I think that the flawed assumption about the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I think that it's very sad, because in Washington, there are many experts, like people that are present in this call, for example, that know Iran, that knew from the get-go that killing Khamenei was top of this regime. This regime not going to capitulate. But I think in a negotiation style, I think what the Iranian offered, if what the Iranian foreign minister said that is true, eventually not accumulating enriched uranium, this is as far as they can go, less than capitulation, because they had to have the centrifuges running. Witkoff, that I will always, as the Israeli, remember the fact that he was the guy that literally pushed for a list of the hostages. I think that he doesn't know and doesn't understand where the Iranians coming from, the importance of enrichment in Iran, regardless of the issue of yes or no nuclear weapon. On top of that, everything is he's saying now, the 30, 40 bombs, this is something that actually highlight the fact that he's not really understanding not the material and not actually Iran itself. And I think this is a major problem, because when you're looking forward, I don't think that the Iranians will negotiate with him specifically, or with the administration as a whole again. I think that they negotiated twice. In their mind, they came in good faith, and then they negotiated, and once Israel attacked them, and the other Israel and the US attacked them. So I think I have a problem also in everything related to the closing mechanism, everything related to negotiations for the future. I'm not saying it's impossible, because it's still the Middle East, so everything is possible. But I think that it's a low possibility. And when you're looking at Mujtaba, and I think that this is the major problem that we are having. I think that definitely, as I mentioned, he's going to.
I think Danny might have cut out there again. Greg, if you want to pick up where Danny left off.
Sure. I mean, I think there is, as Danny mentioned, I think there was a misunderstanding on the U.S. side of what could be accomplished through decapitation, through the removal of certain leadership figures. I do know that there has been reporting suggesting that the administration saw scope for achieving a Venezuela-style victory, that there was perhaps a group of insiders within the regime who had expressed willingness to cooperate with the United States in the event that Khamenei was killed. It's very hard to affirm those kinds of reports. It was also reported that these individuals, incidentally, were killed along with Khamenei in the initial days of the war. So, it's sort of a moot point now whether or not the United States plan would have worked. But I do think, as Danny noted, it speaks to the misunderstanding of Iran's perception of its interests, both during the negotiations, but also during this war. I mean, capitulation has been consistently perceived as more dangerous than enduring a war against the United States and against Israel. I mean, this is a regime that in its institutions, beyond the individuals, but in its institutions, is framed around the idea of resistance against U.S. pressure and resistance against any sign of capitulation and surrender. So seeing as how it's so deeply ingrained in the kind of ideological foundations of the Islamic Republic, I would expect it to be a very, very low probability that they capitulate. That being said, they might be willing to negotiate. I mean, an aspect of the negotiations both prior to this war and last year was that the United States approached them, it would seem, largely from the point of view of take it or leave it. Give us the concessions we're looking for, and we won't bomb you. There wasn't really much of a talk of incentives, which there needs to be in order to create any kind of agreement. That was the whole purpose of the JCPOA, right? Imposing economic costs through sanctions in order to compel Iran to negotiate so that you can then lift the sanctions. This is taking a slightly more longer term view, but I think unless the regime collapses or is changed, the alternatives are continual conflict with sporadic instances of this more intense kinetic operations, which threaten energy, threaten the Strait of Hormuz, impose economic and political costs to the United States, and incidentally to pretty much everybody else, or some kind of negotiated settlement, some kind of diplomatic resolution that addresses Iran's nuclear program, that addresses its other areas that the U.S. wants to see concessions on, and support for regional proxies, potentially its development of ballistic missiles, although, of course, Iran will resist very, very aggressively making any concessions there. But, if you're looking for a resolution and a real victory that addresses the strategic concerns that the U.S. have, it's very hard to accomplish those goals in a concrete way that is durable through military force alone. At some point, they are going to have to negotiate some kind of an agreement. I don't know if it's likely to come soon, but it is the more likely avenue towards resolution. Otherwise, the status quo is this heightened state of confrontation and the heightened risk of military action.
Thank you, Greg. And with that, we will end the event here. I would like to thank all of you for tuning in, and I would like to thank our three speakers tremendously, Greg, Danny, Nagar. It's been a real honor moderating this event, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in.